The Forgotten Child. The morning sun had barely begun to rise over the quiet neighborhood when I stepped outside to take out the trash. The air was crisp, a faint chill lingering as autumn crept closer. It was supposed to be just another ordinary day, but nothing about this morning would be ordinary. As I walked toward the garbage disposal area at the end of the street, I noticed something odd. A rustling sound, faint but distinct, was coming from behind the bins. My first thought was that it was a stray dog or perhaps a raccoon scavenging for scraps. But as I stepped closer, I saw a small, frail figure crouched among the trash bags. A child. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The sight was too shocking, too out of place. A little girl, no older than 6, was rummaging through the discarded food scraps with a single-minded focus. Her small hands, smeared with dirt, clutched a half-moldy piece of bread. She tore into it hungrily, as if it were the most delicious meal she had ever had. I felt my breath hitch. My heart pounded in my chest. She looked familiar, too familiar. Blair, my voice was barely above a whisper, but the girl froze. Slowly, she turned her face toward me, and my entire world came crashing down. It was her, my granddaughter, the child we had mourned. The child we had buried in our hearts as a painful memory. The child we had all been told was dead. But she was right here, alive, and eating rotten bread from the garbage. I fell to my knees, my body trembling as I reached out to her. "Blair, my sweet girl, what are you doing here?" Her eyes darted around as if she was about to run. Fear flickered in her expression, and I realized she didn't recognize me immediately. How long had she been alone? What had she been through? My mind raced with questions, but all I could focus on was getting her out of this filthy place. I tried to keep my voice soft, steady. "It's Grandma. It's me. You're safe now, sweetheart." Blair hesitated. Her body was thin, too thin. Her cheeks were hollow, her clothes ragged and too small for her growing frame. And her eyes, they were filled with something no 6-year-old should ever have to feel. Pain, fear, betrayal. Finally, she whispered, "Grandma." Tears burned my eyes as I nodded frantically. "Yes, baby, it's me." For a brief moment, she seemed unsure. Then, as if something inside her broke, she dropped the moldy bread and threw herself into my arms. She was trembling. No, she was shaking. I held her tightly, shielding her from the cold morning air, from the filth surrounding us, from whatever horror she had endured. My mind was a storm of emotions. How was this possible? How could she survive all these years? And more importantly, who had done this to her? The day Blair went missing. 2 years ago, on a bright summer afternoon, my son Tim and his wife Sandra had taken their 2 children, Blair and her younger brother Christian, on a camping trip. It was supposed to be a weekend filled with laughter, roasting marshmallows, and making family memories. But then, the unimaginable happened. Blair went missing. One moment, she had been playing by the riverbank. The next, she was gone. The entire family had searched frantically, calling her name, retracing their steps. Local authorities joined in, followed by volunteers, news stations, and search dogs. But after 3 days of relentless searching, only a few of Blair's belongings were found near the river. Authorities assumed the worst. She had been swept away by the current. Sandra had been inconsolable. She had collapsed into a deep depression, unable to function. My son Tim did his best to keep the family together, but their world had shattered. And now, 2 years later, that same little girl was in my arms, alive. My hands trembled as I stroked her dirty hair. "Where have you been, my love? Who took you? What happened?" Blair stiffened slightly at my questions, her small hands clutching at my sleeves. She didn't answer. I swallowed hard, pushing down the fear rising in my throat. I didn't want to scare her, not when she was finally back. But I needed to know. I had to know. "Come home with me, sweetheart," I murmured. "Let's get you cleaned up. You're safe now." She didn't argue. She just nodded weakly. Bringing Blair home. I carried Blair back to my house, shielding her from the prying eyes of curious neighbors. The moment we stepped inside, I hurried to run a warm bath, filling it with gentle soap and soothing oils. As I helped her undress, my heart broke all over again. Her small body was covered in bruises, old ones faded to yellow and newer ones fresh and dark. I clenched my jaw, fighting the rage bubbling inside me. Someone had hurt her. Someone had beaten her. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remain calm. Blair, honey, did someone do this to you? She hesitated, then shook her head quickly. I fell. It was a lie, a forced, practiced lie. But I didn't push. Not yet. After her bath, I dressed her in warm, clean clothes and sat her down at the kitchen table with a proper meal. She ate cautiously at first, as if unsure whether she was allowed to. But once she realized I wasn't going to take the food away, she devoured it. I watched her, my heart aching. Who had raised her these past 2 years? Where had she been? And why had she been eating from the trash when she clearly knew table manners? How to use utensils, how to behave. Something wasn't adding up. As she finished her food, I gently reached for my phone. My hands were still shaking, but I had no choice. I needed to call my son. The call that changed everything. "Mom, are you okay?" Tim answered groggily. It was still early, and I knew I was about to change his world forever. I took a deep breath. "Tim, you need to come to my house. Now." There was a pause. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you sick?" I looked at Blair, who was now curled up in a blanket on my couch, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. My voice wavered as I said the words I never thought I'd say. "Tim, Blair is alive." Dead silence. Then, a sharp inhale. "Mom, that's not funny." "I'm not joking." My voice cracked. "She's here. She's real. And she's been through hell." I heard him curse under his breath, then shuffle around, probably throwing on clothes. "I'm coming. Don't let her out of your sight." As the call ended, I sat beside Blair and gently stroked her hair. "Daddy's coming, sweetheart." She tensed slightly but didn't say anything. I watched as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her tiny fingers still clutching the fabric of her blanket. I didn't know what the next few hours would bring. But one thing was certain. Whoever had taken Blair had to answer for what they had done. And I wouldn't stop until I found out the truth. A father's breaking heart. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second stretching like an eternity. I sat on the couch beside Blair, who had drifted into a fitful sleep, her tiny body curled beneath the soft blanket. She looked so fragile, so small. My hands trembled as I smoothed her damp hair, still slightly wet from her bath. How had she survived for 2 years? Who had taken her? Most importantly, why? The sharp, hurried knock at my front door jolted me from my thoughts. I rushed to open it, my heart pounding. Tim stood on my doorstep, his face pale and drawn, his breath labored from the rush over. His dark hair was messy, his usual composed demeanor replaced by a look of pure desperation. "Mom," he breathed, his voice tight with emotion. "Where is she?" I stepped aside, and his eyes immediately locked onto the small figure on the couch. He didn't move for a moment. He just stood there, staring, his body rigid, his hands curled into fists. Then, with slow, cautious steps, he approached. His breath hitched as he knelt beside the couch. "Blair?" His voice was a whisper, filled with so much emotion I felt tears burn at the back of my own eyes. Blair stirred. Her small fingers clutched the blanket tighter before she slowly blinked up at him. For a long moment, she didn't react. Then, recognition flickered in her deep brown eyes. "Daddy?" Tim let out a shaky exhale, his body crumbling as he reached out and gathered her into his arms. His whole frame shook as he clutched her to his chest, his fingers curling around her tiny back as if he was afraid she would disappear again. Blair stiffened at first, her body unsure, hesitant. But then, after a moment, she let out a small broken sob and buried her face in his shoulder. Tim gasped, his own tears falling freely. "Oh, baby girl, I thought you were gone. I thought I lost you forever." I had never seen my son cry like this before. Not even when his father, my husband, had passed. But now, here he was, a father shattered by 2 years of grief, holding the child he thought was dead. Blair clung to him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his jacket. I didn't know where you were. I tried." Her voice broke, and she whimpered, "I thought you forgot me." Tim pulled back just enough to cup her face in his hands. "Never, never, Blair." His voice was fierce, his grief evident in every syllable. "I love you so much. I never stopped looking for you." Blair sniffled, nodding weakly. Tim pressed a kiss to her forehead before shifting slightly to look at me. His expression hardened, his jaw clenching. "Mom, tell me everything. Where did you find her?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. I saw her at the garbage dump. She was eating out of the trash, Tim." My voice wavered. She was starving. Tim's body tensed, his eyes darkening with something dangerous. "Who did this?" His voice was low, controlled. But I knew my son. He was seething. Blair flinched at his tone, and I immediately reached out to touch his arm. "Tim, calm down." He inhaled sharply, trying to regain control. "Baby," he said gently, turning back to Blair, his voice soft again. "Can you tell me? Who took you?" Blair's expression changed. Her tiny hands clutched his jacket tighter, and she shook her head quickly. I can't." Her voice was small, terrified. "I promised I wouldn't." Tim frowned. "Promised who?" She clamped her lips shut, shaking her head again, her whole body trembling. I felt my stomach churn. Whoever had taken her had conditioned her to stay silent. Tim glanced at me, his expression a mix of frustration and worry. "Mom, she's scared." "I know," I said softly. "We can't force her to talk. We have to be patient." Tim ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I can't be patient, Mom. Someone stole my daughter. Someone let her starve." His voice cracked, and he clenched his jaw. Blair whimpered, curling into his chest. Tim immediately softened, wrapping his arms around her. "I'm sorry, baby girl. I didn't mean to scare you." She nodded against him, but I could still see the fear in her eyes. Whoever had taken her had left more than just physical scars. A mother's suspicion. After a long moment, I stood up and walked into the kitchen, trying to process everything. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what to do next. That's when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and froze. Sandra, my son's wife, the mother who had spent 2 years grieving. Why was she calling now? I hesitated before answering. "Hello, Elizabeth." Sandra's voice came through the line, overly sweet. "I was just calling to see if you and Tim wanted to bring Christian over later. He's been asking about his big sister again." My stomach twisted. Blair was sitting right here, and Sandra had no idea. But why did this call feel forced? I tightened my grip on the phone. "Sandra, do you still think about Blair?" There was a pause. "Of course I do," she said quickly. Too quickly. Not a day goes by that I don't miss her. Something in her voice made my skin prickle. "That's interesting," I said carefully, watching Tim stroke Blair's hair as she finally started to relax in his arms. "Because I found her." Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then, finally, Sandra spoke. "Elizabeth," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Are you sure about that?" Something inside me snapped. Of course I'm sure. She's here with me. She's alive. Tim's head snapped up at my words, his eyes narrowing. Sandra let out a breathy laugh. "Wow," she murmured. "That's unexpected. Unexpected." My grip on the phone tightened. Tim stood up, his expression dangerous. "Mom, put it on speaker." I did as he asked. "Sandra," he said, his voice cold. "What do you mean unexpected?" Sandra hesitated. "Tim, listen to me," she said, her voice taking on a nervous edge. "I need you to bring her to me. Right now." Tim let out a humorless laugh. "Are you insane? You think I'd let you anywhere near her?" Sandra's voice sharpened. "Tim, you don't understand. You need to bring her to me before they find out she's alive." My blood ran cold. "They?" Tim's face darkened, his grip on Blair tightening protectively. "Who is they?" "Sandra." But before she could answer, the line went dead. Silence filled the room. Blair, who had been quietly listening, suddenly began shaking. "No, no, no," she whispered. "She told me they'd find me if I ever left. She told me I couldn't leave." Tim and I exchanged looks. Sandra knew something, and we were going to find out exactly what she was hiding. A father's fear and a mother's lies. The silence in the room was suffocating. The weight of Sandra's words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. "Before they find out she's alive. You need to bring her to me right now." Those words played on a loop in my mind, each repetition sending a fresh wave of unease through me. Tim's face was a mask of barely restrained fury as he clenched his fists at his sides. I could see the muscles in his jaw twitch, his entire body coiled with tension. Blair, on the other hand, had curled into herself, small hands gripping Tim's jacket as if he was her anchor to this world. Who had told her she couldn't leave? And why? I took a slow, deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm for her sake. "Tim, we need to think before we act," I said carefully, watching the way his entire frame vibrated with anger. "Think," he spat, his eyes blazing. "Mom, she was gone for 2 years. 2 damn years. And Sandra, my wife, knows something about it. And now she wants us to just bring Blair to her like we'd actually hand her over." His voice cracked slightly at the end, and I saw the raw pain beneath his rage. I reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "I know, but we can't let our emotions take control. Blair is already terrified. We need to be careful." Tim swallowed hard, glancing down at his daughter, who hadn't spoken since Sandra's phone call. His expression softened slightly, and he exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "Okay," he muttered. "Okay, you're right. But what the hell do we do now?" I glanced at Blair, who was staring at the floor, her tiny hands still trembling. "Sweetheart," I said gently, kneeling in front of her. "I know you're scared, but we need to know the truth. What did Sandra mean? Who told you that you couldn't leave?" Blair's breathing hitched, and her small fingers curled into fists. For a long moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, finally, she whispered. She did. Tim and I exchanged a sharp look. "Sandra?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Blair nodded, barely perceptible. Tim knelt down, gripping her shoulders gently. "Blair, baby, listen to me. You never have to go back there, okay? No one will take you from me again." A tear slid down her cheek, but she didn't say anything. Something about this wasn't making sense. Why would Sandra hide her own daughter away for 2 years? Unless... A horrible realization clawed its way into my mind, making my stomach turn. Unless Blair wasn't supposed to come back at all. The thought sent ice through my veins. Tim stood abruptly. "I need to go talk to her," he muttered. "I need to see her face when I ask her about this." "Tim, no," I said quickly. "She's expecting you. You can't just walk into her house unprepared." Tim let out a frustrated growl, pacing the room. "Then what do we do?" I hesitated. "We need proof. If Sandra did something to Blair, if she's hiding something, we can't just confront her with words. We need evidence." Tim ran a hand through his hair. "How do we get that?" I turned to Blair. "Sweetheart, do you remember where you were? Did you ever hear anyone talk about a place, a name?" Blair fidgeted, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her borrowed shirt. "I was in a house," she murmured. Not like this one. It was small and cold. There were trees outside. A lot of trees. Tim's brows furrowed. A cabin. Blair nodded. Did you see anyone besides Sandra? I pressed. Blair hesitated. Sometimes, she admitted. There was a man. He had a deep voice. But he never talked to me. Only to her. A shiver ran down my spine. Tim clenched his fists again. Mom, she was kept somewhere. Not just hidden. She was trapped. I nodded, my mind racing. Sandra didn't just keep Blair away. She had someone else involved. And that meant this was bigger than just a family dispute. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. We need to find that cabin. If we can prove Blair was there, if we can find anything linking Sandra to it, we can take it to the police. Tim nodded grimly. Then let's find it. The search begins. An hour later, we were driving through the outskirts of town, following the vague description Blair had given us. Tim was gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. I sat beside him, scanning the landscape for anything that matched what Blair had described. Blair was in the back seat, staring out the window with wide, wary eyes. The town slowly faded behind us, replaced by thick woods and winding roads. This is the kind of place someone could disappear in, Tim muttered darkly. I shivered. We drove for nearly an hour before Blair suddenly sat up straighter. Wait, she said, her voice urgent. That road, the one with the broken sign. We went down there before. Tim didn't hesitate. He turned sharply, the tires kicking up gravel as we veered onto the narrow dirt road. The deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The trees were dense, shadows stretching across the path like grasping fingers. Then suddenly, Blair whispered, "Stop." Tim slammed on the brakes. There, barely visible through the trees, was a small weathered cabin. It looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the wood rotting in places. But something about it made my stomach churn. Tim cut the engine, his breathing ragged. This is it. Blair shrank back into her seat, her small body trembling. I don't want to go in there, she whispered. I turned around, taking her hands gently in mine. You don't have to, sweetheart. Stay here with me. Your dad will check it out. Tim was already unbuckling his seatbelt, his jaw tight with determination. I'll be fast, he promised. I watched as he stepped out, carefully making his way toward the cabin. Something about this felt wrong. Like we were missing something. Then, just as Tim reached the porch, the front door creaked open, and someone stepped out. A tall figure. A man. Blair let out a small, terrified gasp. My blood ran cold. Tim froze. The man tilted his head, a slow, eerie smile spreading across his face. Well, he drawled. Didn't expect to see you here, Tim. Tim's entire body went rigid. He knew this man. And from the look on his face, I knew this was about to get much, much worse. The truth unveiled, and justice served. Tim stood frozen on the cabin porch, his body tense as he stared at the man who had just stepped outside. The air between them was thick with tension, so suffocating that even I, watching from the car, could feel it pressing against my chest. Blair let out a tiny, strangled gasp, her small hands clutching my arm tightly. Daddy, that's him. Her whisper sent a chill down my spine. Tim took a slow step forward. You, he breathed, his voice barely controlled. You're the one who had my daughter. The man chuckled, a sound so casual it made my stomach turn. Had. He echoed, raising an eyebrow. Such an interesting way to put it. Tim's fists clenched at his sides. Where's Sandra? His voice was steel, his entire frame vibrating with the sheer force of his barely restrained rage. The man exhaled, stepping off the porch casually, as if this was just another day for him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a rough beard and sun-weathered skin. There was something cold and calculating in his eyes. She's gone, he said simply. My breath hitched. Gone. What did that mean? Tim took another step forward. Where? The man tilted his head. Not my problem anymore, he said with a smirk. She made a mess, tried to clean it up. And now? Well, let's just say she ran out of options. Tim's body tensed like a coiled spring. You're lying. The man let out another low chuckle. Maybe. Maybe not. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a cigarette and lighting it like we weren't standing in the middle of a nightmare. You want to know the truth? He asked, exhaling a plume of smoke. Your wife wasn't as smart as she thought she was. She thought she could control everything. Thought she could keep that kid locked away forever. But you see, desperate people do stupid things. He gestured toward the woods behind the cabin. She tried to disappear last night. Took off before she could fix her mistake. Guess she figured it was easier to run than to face the consequences. A sickening silence followed his words. Sandra was gone. Tim's hands were trembling now, barely holding himself together. I could see the war inside of him. Rage, confusion, fear. You helped her, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. The man smirked again. Helped? No, I worked for her. There's a difference. Tim's jaw clenched. Not anymore. You're going to jail for what you did to my daughter. The man rolled his eyes. You think you can prove anything. And that was when I stepped out of the car. You mean the cameras inside the cabin? I said, my voice clear and sharp. The man stiffened. Tim turned to me, eyes widening slightly in realization. You really think Sandra didn't cover her tracks? I continued, taking slow, deliberate steps toward them. She had this whole thing documented. For control, for leverage, and now, it's all yours to answer for. The smirk on the man's face faltered. Tim didn't hesitate. In one swift movement, he pulled out his phone, dialing 911. I want to report a case of child abduction and illegal captivity. I have proof, and I have the man responsible. The man turned to bolt, but he wasn't fast enough. Tim lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the side of the cabin. You don't run, Tim growled. Not after what you did. I could hear the dispatcher on the other end of the call, but I couldn't focus on the words. Because Blair had stepped out of the car. She stood there, small and trembling, staring at the man who had been part of her nightmare for 2 years. He noticed her, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression. Unease. Blair didn't speak. She didn't move. But her eyes, filled with silent strength, met his. He looked away first. Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. The aftermath. The police arrived swiftly, taking the man into custody. As officers moved through the cabin, they found what we had suspected. Evidence. Sandra's detailed notes. Financial transactions. Camera footage of Blair. Everything. It was enough to make sure the man never saw the outside world again. Sandra, however, was still missing. For weeks, the police searched for her, but she had truly vanished without a trace. Some believed she had fled the country. Others thought she might have gone into hiding under a new identity. Tim, for his part, stopped looking. She's already dead to me, he had said simply. And in a way, I understood. She had already lost the one thing she had tried so desperately to control. A new beginning. Months passed. Blair slowly, carefully, started to heal. She still had nightmares, but they were less frequent. She still flinched at loud noises, but she no longer hid when she heard them. Tim moved us to a new town, a fresh start for all of us. And Blair blossomed. She started school again. She made friends. She laughed. And one day, as we sat in the backyard, watching the sun set over our new home, she turned to Tim and whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Tim swallowed hard, pulling her into a tight hug. "I will always find you," he whispered back. And in that moment I knew, no matter what happened next, we had already won. Because Blair was finally home, and nothing could ever take her away from us again. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.